For as many have sinned without the law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and makest thy boast of God, and know his will, and approvest the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and art confident that thou thyself, verse 19, art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which hast the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law, dishonourest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written, For circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. But if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfil the law, judge thee, who by the letter and circumcision does transgress the law? For he is not a Jew which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. Right, well, sounds complicated. Well, it might sound complicated, but actually it's quite simple. This is the thing about Romans, is that sometimes you can come to one verse or two verses and you can spend the whole Bible study on those, because of the theological and the doctrinal weight of that particular verse or verses. But in this case, what Paul is saying is actually quite a simple point. He's just examining it from various angles, and so I think we can go through it all tonight, really, and you'll get an idea of what he's saying. I think in some ways that Romans would be better if we could actually remove all the chapter numbers, and just kind of have it all together. I mean, you couldn't really do that because it's just such a, if we did that, it would be such a lot of verses and everything, to a lot of words to look at. But it would be better in some ways to remove it, because what we would get then is the context of what Paul's saying, and that will just help us so much. So for example, what he's saying here in chapter 2 from verse 12 onwards is really still a continuation of what he was saying in chapter 1, and in the same way, when we get up to things like Romans 11, it is better understood in the context of things like Romans 9. Again, Romans 7 is better understood in the context of Romans 6 and Romans 8. And so if you could just get rid of, in your head, that kind of division of the chapters, I think it is helpful to really get an understanding of what Paul's talking about. So what was he talking about in Romans chapter 1? Well, do you remember he was focusing on the Gentiles? And he was basically saying the Gentiles, as they stand before God, or although they didn't have the law like the Jews, they are without excuse, because they have nature, they have the revelation of God in nature through what has been created, and they have the revelation of God through their own conscience, and we looked at that, didn't we? And then as we got to the beginning of chapter 2, we saw how Paul then shifted his attention to the Jews and started to ask the sort of similar questions of the Jews. And again, what he's doing is, all the way through these first 2 chapters, is he's warming up to getting to what we call chapter 3. And there he's going to make his big point, which we won't go to tonight, but that's where he's heading to. But he's doing it in a very, very sort of thorough and almost systematic way. So what we have here is more proof of what we call God's equity. The fact that God is very just, very equal in the way in which he's judging different types of people and different people groups. And this is still what Paul is showing us here, how fair God is, how equal God is with his judgment, how there's no special cases. Do you remember the last verse that we looked at was Romans chapter 2 verse 11, for there is no respect of persons with God. There's no special cases with God. Nobody who's above God's judgment or beneath God's judgment. Rather, his judgment is always fair, it's always righteous, it's always equal. It equals its way out. And so what we're looking at tonight is really what Matthew Henry calls the 3 degrees of light. Light in the Bible often, as I said before, synonymous with truth. And so we're looking at what God has revealed to different peoples around the world and throughout the ages. And there are, broadly speaking, if you like, 3 degrees of light. The first degree is the one that we looked at in chapter 1, and that is the light of nature, or the light of natural conscience, which, remember, the Gentiles, the non-Jews, possess this light of natural conscience. So they didn't receive the Mosaic law. There was no special revelation, and yet they're able to see that certain things are right and certain things are wrong. Why? Because God has written his law on their hearts, just as much as he wrote the law on tablets of stone for the Jews. With the Gentiles, he has written his law upon their hearts. Now we know that because at the end of chapter 1 there, verse 32, when Paul kind of sums up the Gentiles and the immorality and the idolatry that they're in, he says this: who, knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. So what's he saying? He's saying that yes, the pagans and the Gentiles are living like this. They're living in sin, they're living in immorality and idolatry, but they know that these things are wrong, and they know that God will judge people who do that. Nevertheless, they've chosen to override what their conscience has told them and to do it anyway. And so this is very important to understand, that the life that they're living, the transgression that they're committing, is in violation of their own conscience. They have this moral law, and it is written on their hearts. And we talked about summing up the moral law. If we want to sum up the moral law, what is it? We can take something like the 10 Commandments, and that gives us a good idea really of what the moral law is. And if you share the gospel with people and you follow the sort of Ray Comfort type approach, that's exactly what you do. You approach people generally who don't know very much about the scriptures, but you talk about things like, have you ever stolen anything, have you ever lied, and so you're using like the 10 Commandments really to bring conviction to their heart and to show them, saying, well then, therefore you've broken God's law, therefore it's right for God to judge you. And that's how it works, because we understand that everybody has this written on their heart, this innate understanding that it's wrong to steal, it's wrong to commit adultery, and so on. And we can further confirm that with the scriptures, but that in itself is written on the hearts of the Gentiles. So, coming back to the text then, coming down here to verse 12, for as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. So he's talking now about Gentiles and Jews, isn't he? So those who don't have the law, that is, who don't have a written law, shall also perish. Notice it doesn't say shall not be judged. It's very important. Paul is very careful in this passage and how he uses words. It says, for as many as have sinned without the law, the Gentiles, shall also perish without the law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged, that's the Jews, shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Now this is picked up in James, isn't it? Let me have a look now. Yes, James chapter 1, isn't it? This principle is picked up in James. James 1. James 1 verse 22. Just a well-known verse. But be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own selves. So like you're saying in verse 13, it's not the hearers of the law who are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. So again, he's echoing James there. And then in verse 14, he makes this important point. For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves. So the law, the moral law that we talk about, the Ten Commandments and so on, it's no good having that law, knowing that law, unless you do it, is it? That's the whole point of the law, is that you must do it, and you must do it completely, and you must do it perpetually without stopping. That was the point of the law. It's what the law taught, wasn't it? You must keep these things and you must do them continually. Deuteronomy 4 is... Deuteronomy 4 verse 1 says, Now therefore hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you, for to do them, that ye may live, and go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers giveth you. So what Moses is saying here is, or rather God is saying through Moses, is that you have to do them. It's not enough to know them, or to meditate upon them, or to remember them and be able to recite them. You know, however much you can recite them, it's no good unless you do it, and you must do it continually. So what Paul is saying is that when the Gentiles do those things in the law, verse 14, when the Gentiles which have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves. And verse 15 says, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. So first of all, their own thoughts will tell them, no, you shouldn't do that, or yes, that was a good thing to do. So their own thoughts will either accuse them or will excuse them, but they will also do this with those around them. They'll look at somebody else, if they see them stealing, they'll say, well, that's wrong, we shouldn't be doing that. Or if they see them doing something good, they'll say, oh, that's good, he's doing that. And what Paul is saying is, even though they don't have the written law, when they do what that law says, then are they not fulfilling the law anyway? And does it not all equal out? It's just the same as if you as a Jew actually have the law but don't do it. Well, you know, what advantage have you got by just having the law, knowing the law, and yet not doing it? So, verse 15, will show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or excusing one another, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. So let's just stop there for a second. So what we have here really that Paul is touching on is the light of the natural conscience, the truth of the Gentiles' natural conscience, showing them what is right and wrong. We also have sort of alluded to there the light of the law. So the Jews themselves have they also have God's law on their conscience, don't they? Every person does. Every human being has God's law written on the conscience. But the Jews have something more. They have it written down in words. They have it specific and explicit. So, like for example, if you drive up a road and you think, I'll just park my car here, and then you look around and think, actually, it's probably not a good place to park. If I park here, I'm going to cause a bit of an obstruction if I park here, and so I probably shouldn't park here. But then, if you go to a road and it's got double yellow lines down it, you know for a fact you shouldn't park there, because you'd be breaking the law, because you understand that the law states you're not to park on double yellow lines. So kind of using that rather clumsy illustration, you can see that the Gentiles know certain things are wrong and certain things are right, but the Jews have even greater light than that, because they've actually got it written down. They know thou shalt and thou shalt not. And so they have, if you like, greater light. And so in that sense, do you remember we looked last week in chapter 2, verse 9, there will be tribulation and anguish upon every soul of man that doeth evil, of the Jew first, and also the Gentile. So the judgment of God will come to the Jew first, because they received the law first. They received Christ's teaching first. Remember, he came first, the lost sheep of Israel. And also the apostles first of all came to them and then went to the Gentiles. So in that sense, the Jews have these advantages, but also, like the scriptures say, for unto whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required. Luke 12:48. So yes, they have a lot, but then a lot is required of them as well, because they have this specific written law. But being Jewish and having the law does not justify them in God's sight any more than being a Gentile and not having the law excuses them. So this is what Paul, you see how God is making it equal, making it fair. He's saying, yes, the Jews have the law, but that's not advantageous to them unless they're actually obeying the law. Remember, to obey the law, you had to obey it perfectly and continually and perpetually. That's what James says, doesn't he? If you break the law in one point, you've broken all of it. So it's no good saying, well, I think I've been pretty good. I mean, these people say this, don't they? I might have stolen, but I've never told a lie. Irrelevant, because the law states that it must be obeyed, and it must be obeyed continually in order to justify a person before God. And we know that that's not possible. That's why you can't be justified by the law. So coming down now then to verse 17. Behold, thou art called a Jew, and restest in the law, and make thy boast of God, and knowest his will, and approve the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of a law, and art confident that thou thyself art a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, a teacher of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge, verse 20, and of the truth in the law. So these are really terms that the Jews would use of Gentiles: the blind, the foolish, babes, like children. This is how they would look down on the Gentiles. And again, we touched a little bit on that last week, didn't we? The kind of really the arrogance of some of the Jews, and that we're the chosen people, we've got the law, and so on. So Paul is picking up on this. If this is what you think you are, if this is how you see yourselves. Verse 21, thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? And Jesus himself kind of brought this idea, didn't he, of, you know, it's all right saying I don't commit adultery, but do you lust after a woman in your heart? You know, it's all right saying, well, I've not murdered anybody, but are you angry with somebody in your heart? And so here he's saying, you know, you who say do not steal, do you steal? Just go to Malachi chapter 3, just at the end of the Old Testament there. Last book in the Old Testament. Malachi 3 and verse 8. It says, will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. So you can see there are all different ways in which these words can be taken. Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, verse 22. Dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? So again, we talked about this, different types of idolatry, things like spiritual adultery. So what Paul's trying to do is, again, convict the Jews of much of their hypocrisy. And so, verse 23, thou that makest thy boast of the law, through breaking the law, dishonourest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. So the conclusion, if you like, of this section is really that when the Gentiles do those things that the law requires, even though they haven't got a written law, are they not just the same as somebody who has a written law and follows it? So he's saying all men are equal, really. You know, God requires obedience. So if they're being obedient, even though they don't have a written law, and you have this written law, but you're not obeying it, how are you better than them? Does that make sense? How are you superior to them just because you've got a written law? Again, it's showing, what Paul's trying to show is that all are under sin. All have fallen short of the glory of God. I'm kind of getting a bit ahead of myself, but that is really where Paul is heading it up. And he's trying to do it in a very methodical way, and he's trying to get the Jews particularly to think about themselves and to think about what they have and really what is it worth. If it's just an outward show of things, really what is that worth? Okay, so verse 25, he now turns to the question of circumcision. So verse 25 says this: for circumcision verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. Okay, stop there for a minute. What does that mean? What he's saying is circumcision profiteth. It has meaning if you keep the law. Why? Because circumcision circumcision of the body is an outward sign that a change has taken place within your heart, that you belong to the Lord. It's, if you like, the sign of the old covenant, in the same way that baptism is the sign of the new covenant. Now, does baptism profiteth? Well, yes, it does. It has meaning if it's a description of what has taken place in your life. If you really have been buried with Christ, crucified with Christ, and you're risen to new life. Does it have any meaning just in itself? Does getting somebody and just baptising them under water actually mean anything? No, not unless it's an outward sign of what has happened inside. Then it's just, that's all it is. It's just an outward sign. But if it's a reflection of what's happened inside, then yes, it means something. It's what Paul is saying here. He says, circumcision truthfully or verily profiteth, if thou keep the law. Now, can they keep the law? No. So, if thou be a breaker of the law, thy circumcision is made uncircumcision. Therefore, if the uncircumcision, that is, if the Gentiles, he's calling them the uncircumcision, the Gentiles. If the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? Saying, is he not equal to you? If he's keeping the law, just because he hasn't had this outward sign, then if he's a Gentile who keeps the law, is he not as good as the circumcised? And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfill the law, judge thee, we would perhaps say condemn you, who by the letter and circumcision does transgress the law? So he's saying, here's a Gentile, here's a Jew. This Gentile is uncircumcised, and yet he's keeping the law. This Jew is physically circumcised, and yet he's not keeping the law. So therefore, the Gentile is going to condemn by his actions the one who says, well, hey, I've been circumcised. So, for he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. So, what he's saying is, what counts with God is not an outward circumcision at all, but is this circumcision of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter. In the letter means not in ritual, men saying words or even writing words about you. That doesn't mean anything if it's not actually happened in your heart. So just as we would say, well, being baptized, yes, that might mean something if there's been a change in your heart, if that's taken place, if you've been born again. But just being baptized on its own isn't going to mean anything. And what's interesting is this circumcision of the heart actually is an Old Testament concept as well. It's in the Old Testament. If you look at, we can go to it now, it's where I got confused before, Deuteronomy 30. Deuteronomy 30. Verse 6. And the Lord thy God will circumcise thine heart, and the heart of thy seed, to love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul, that thou mayest live. And again, it's kind of catching on to the words that Jesus uses, isn't it, in Matthew 22, 37 to 38, who talks about love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength, and love your neighbour as yourself. That is this circumcision of the heart, this putting away of all inward impurity. That is what it means. Otherwise, what is circumcision of the heart? It can't just simply mean, well, I believe in Jesus. It is talking, just as in the Old Testament, it was a cutting away of part of the flesh and putting it from you. In the circumcision of the heart, it's a cutting away of that fleshly, carnal life and putting it from you with the strength that the Spirit of God supplies. That's why it says in the Spirit, okay, in your spirit, by the Holy Spirit. It's what doesn't. It's not a circumcision that is done by hands, as Paul says elsewhere. It's a circumcision that is done by God, and that is essentially what God requires. And so what we're saying here is that whether you are a Gentile who has received the light of the natural conscience, or whether you're a Jew who has received the light of the law, none of these things will profit you anything unless you are circumcised in the heart. That's what God requires. And so that's two aspects of light or truth that we have received, that man has received. But I said there was three, didn't I? So the third and final aspect I want you to think about is the light of the gospel. So the Gentiles were guilty before God because they had received the light of natural conscience and had disobeyed it. The Jews were guilty before God because they had received the light of the law, but they hadn't kept it. we have received the gospel. That is, we have the light of the natural conscience. We know the law because we have the Old Testament here in front of us, and we also have the New Testament, the New Covenant, the light of the gospel. And so, for example, we can turn to Romans chapter 1 and we can even talk about what the natural conscience is and so forth. So I would say that Christians, above everybody else, how will we be judged if we are not obedient to Christ? How will we be judged if we don't, as it were, separate ourselves from carnality and from sin? If God requires much of the Gentiles and of the Jews, how is it that some Christians think he's not going to require anything of them? That they can carry on sinning and it won't matter. God won't judge them. What about the equity, the equalness, the fairness of God? Just let's finish with this. Just go to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews 10:28. He that despised Moses' law died without mercy under 2 or 3 witnesses. So the writer of Hebrews here straight away is going to compare now the Christian experience with the law of Moses. We've just been talking about, haven't we? Okay, verse 29. Of how much sorer punishment, or how much worse punishment, suppose ye shall he be thought worthy, who hath trodden under foot the Son of God, and hath counted the blood of the covenant wherewith he was sanctified an unholy thing, and hath done despite unto the Spirit of grace. We've actually got, although we're more blessed than the Gentiles and those Jews under the old covenant, because we've received this new covenant. Yeah, brilliant, but we also now have more of a responsibility before God. We've received far more light than either of those groups of people that had received. And so now, with that extra responsibility, we also have, thank God, the power of the Spirit of God to enable us to walk in obedience and to walk in that moral law that I spoke of before. So that's what Paul is doing here, is really saying there is no excuse, whoever you are, before God. There's no defence we can give before God that, God's not going to judge me. And what he's doing is preparing the ground for what he's going to say here in Romans chapter 3. He's going to prove the guilt of the world, that there's nothing you or I can lean on other than Christ, nothing we can turn to other than this circumcision of the heart that God has done within us.